Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, MPA and ICOPCE for having us over here. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever time zone applicable to you. Welcome to the MPA ICOPCE panel discussion, Plenary 1 session, Future-Proofing Marine Environment Protection in a Changing Landscape. Given the society's zero tolerance to marine spills, this is very important and relevant topic and affecting all of us. This is how we want our marine ecosystem to be. Clean beaches, clean oceans, clean seas, clean ports, and the best scenario is never to have a spill. We have to, however, recognize the facts that the accidents can and they do happen. Although the shipping accidents account for only a small proportion of oil released into the marine environment worldwide, they can result in a sudden escape of sufficient quantity to cause damage because a huge quantity of oil would concentrate in a single location. Also, given the ever-increasing size of the vessel, there is an increasing risk of high consequence events. Add this to increased frequency of extreme weather events, growing use of Arctic routes, wider range of fuels used on board the vessels. The industry may require a very sophisticated incident management system involving international response from government and industry. The challenges are how such responder-dependent response we mobilize during a global pandemic, and therefore a rethink is needed how to conduct an effective response in this situation. And this may have an immediate impact on wildlife, fisheries, coastal and marine habitats. The economic consequences of oil chemical spills are often extensive, particularly for the people who depend on the resources or natural beauty of the area for their livelihood. Say, for example, fishing, aquaculture, tourism, and the related industry. We have a panel of distinguished speakers, and they are expert in their own field. What we are going to discuss here, after my short presentation on P&I-related claims, we will focus on the panel discussion, and our primary aim is to consider first the COVID-19 pandemic, how the industry has navigated the challenges of the pandemic, how to deal with a marine casualty, and how to overcome barriers to effective response. We will then discuss some broad issues around mega container ship fire, which industry is still struggling to deal with, particularly in context of some design limitations, misdeclared, improper stored dangerous goods, inadequately prepared port facilities, port of refuge, and firefighting. We will then discuss challenges of responding to today's fuel oils, that is VLSFO and ULSFO, as well as current and future alternative fuels, for example, LNG, ammonia, methanol, etc. And lastly, given the panel's expertise we will discuss what does good environmental performance looks like, and what are the strategic and tactical considerations the industry should take to exceed stakeholders' expectations. I will now hand over to Darren, who will introduce one specific scenario, and I will then follow on. Darren, over to you.
Thank you, Captain. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And first of all, I'd like to say thank you to MPA for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion. At OSRL, we're great supporters of ICOPCE and believe it's a good opportunity to discuss and debate the evolving issues. So the next few slides I'm going to share with you kind of highlight a number of the evolving issues, and that may be specific to the container shipping industry or the broader shipping industry. I'm not really going to provide answers to these issues, but really set the scene for what are the evolving issues and give some examples of past events, and it gives us an opportunity to think about if those events happened again with the evolving issues, what will we do and what are some challenges we face? So first of all, the first point here, I guess, speaks for itself. Larger ships hold more bunkers, increasing worst-case scenario oil spills. So with vessels now holding in excess of 16,000 cubic meters of fuel oil, there, of course, is a possibility for increased risk. However, it should be said that risk as a factor of probability and severity isn't necessarily increased just because you increase the volume of oil. And it is a positive note that the shipping industry has greatly reduced the probability of spills over recent years with better design of ships, crew training, regulation, navigational aids, etc. However, that doesn't take away the factor that if you simply have more oil on board the ship, you have an increase in the worst case scenario, the most credible worst case scenario. And therefore, owner-operators have to consider if they change their ships, if they enhance their ships, do they go for these new ships which have different oil or greater volumes, how does that change their risk profile? Are they still prepared? What could the impacts be? So it's a question to ask yourself as an owner-operator. Second point, so larger capacity for containers increases potential for greater volume and range of dangerous goods. Obviously, with the mega container vessels now carrying around 24,000 TEU of containers, there is this increased opportunity for, as I say, greater volume of dangerous goods, but obviously a greater range and mixing. And really with any incident that involves the spillage of chemicals or dangerous goods from a container vessel, one thing's for sure is there's a level of uncertainty. There is a huge permutation of outcomes that could happen from mixing of chemicals, chemicals mixing with oil, chemicals reacting when they come into the contact with the sea or the ship itself. And therefore, any event that includes the release of dangerous goods, chemicals, is complex. And with the bigger ships, we need to think again, how does that change the risk? Are we still prepared? What would the impacts be? The next point, greater demand for plastic continues to increase the shipment of feedstock. So in 2019, there was nearly 400 million tons of plastics produced globally, which means there's going to be an increase of the feedstock, and much of that feedstock is transported by the shipping industry. These little plastic pellets that we call nurdles. And in today's world, you spill anything from your ship, whether it's oil, chemical, or plastics, there's an expectation that it needs to be effectively cleaned up. Therefore, we need to be prepared for that. And I will talk more in a moment about plastics. As Captain mentioned just a moment ago, increased frequency of extreme weather events. With the unwelcome reality of global warming, we not only see the increased frequency, but the increase in the violence of these weather events, increased energy that they can emit. And since humans have been first navigating the seas, we've all been very aware of the challenges of storms and wind that present a hazard to shipping. Wider range of fuel oils, each requiring a different blend of spill response techniques. So of course with IMO 2020, which saw the introduction of low sulfur, ultra low sulfur fuel oils, there is now a different set of fuel oils available on the market. The traditional oils, of course, are still there. Ships that are operating with scrubbers still use these higher sulfur fuel oils. So we have a new range of fuel oils that we need to be prepared for to be able to respond to. And they give us different challenges. It's still an oil, still use the same techniques, but you need a different blend, but also need to understand what are the potential impacts of these different oils. So again, as an owner-operator, does everyone understand the challenges of converting over to a low sulfur fuel, ultra low sulfur fuel, in terms of its potential environmental impact and the challenges of cleaning it up? Growing use of the Northern Sea route. I guess that's a more broader context of, with global warming again, the Arctic areas are becoming more accessible and accessible for longer. And therefore we're seeing an increased volume of shipping activity in these regions, potentially bringing vessels in closer contact to highly sensitive environments. So again, what does that mean as an owner-operator? responsible for incidents that happen from the vessel? How prepared are we for when the inevitable may happen, which is, oil spills? We put a lot of effort into prevention, but we need to be prepared when it happens. So are we ready for that? And the last point, a simple one, but growing amounts of shoreline litter. I'm sure, like many people my age, we've seen the change in our shorelines, and it's an unfortunate one, that an increased amount of plastic and other debris that covers our shoreline today. And any oil spill that eventually impacts the shoreline, that greatly increases the problems with waste management. Therefore, it's not just oil and oil sediment you're dealing with, but much larger quantities of plastic and other litter that's washed up on the shoreline that becomes contaminated waste and really increases the problems associated with waste management. Nurdles, I said I'd come back to plastics. So, of course, there is this greater demand for plastics globally, and these little plastic pellets that were called nurdles are, of course, transported by ships around the world. And again, prevention is better than cure. There are ways to reduce the probability of losing nurdles from a ship, but we do need to also plan for if the spill happens. And these things are damaging to the environment. They might seem relatively inert, but they do get consumed by marine animals and seabirds, and therefore they pose a hazard, not just to the animals, but they pollute the shorelines. And these plastics also attract other marine pollutants that adhere to the surface. And as we know, plastics degrade very slowly. So these pellets, as you get photo-oxidization that occurs with them, they just break down and become microplastics. So as a shipping industry, of course, we need to be prepared. Spills, unfortunately, will happen occasionally, and therefore there needs to be processes, methods, plans in place to be able to deal with these plastics that wash up on the shoreline. Just a few examples now, and really just to highlight some of the points that I made. These are obviously historical incidents, but it's an opportunity to think about, with these evolving challenges, if these spills happened again, what would be different? How would we deal with it? So the first one, MSC Tritcher, over 400 tons of bunker oil spilt. It was carrying 31 containers of declared dangerous goods, a number of which had fallen into the sea. One particular container accidentally got broken in the salvage operation, which released around 2,000 plus canisters of aluminium phosphide, both some into the sea and some into the hold of the ship. And aluminium phosphide mixing with water, which of course is a high opportunity there with it spilling into the sea, produces phosphine gas. So these are the challenges not only for the responders but also for the salvors. And you can see a picture there in the bottom right of some canisters washed up in the shoreline, but also mixed with the fuel oil that was spilt from the vessel. So some of the challenges associated with dangerous goods. A bit closer to home, APL Denver. Luckily there was no containers or cargo over the side. But this is an incident, again, relatively small oil spill, approximately 300 cubic meters, but it's a heavy viscous oil. Here in Singapore, where we've got relatively high temperature, it's not too much of an issue, but it is still viscous, and it limits some of the opportunities that you have for cleaning up the oil. If that had been in a colder environment, it would have been more difficult because the oil would be more viscous and more challenging. But it did impact some of the aquaculture around, and therefore that presented some different challenges for cleaning that up, not just from the shoreline or from the open sea, but from the aquaculture that was contaminated. And in New Zealand, the MV Rena, again, similar size of oil spill, 100, 350 tons, happened further offshore, which a greater opportunity for the oil to move and spread out, so it impacted a greater amount of shoreline. Again, a number of containers with hazardous materials. Obviously, oil can impact the shoreline. It moves with the ocean, with the wind and the waves and the currents, and therefore you can do some work to predict where it's going, but you can't really control it. And this impacted some culturally important indigenous sites. There was a sizable wildlife impact, so important seabirds and other animals. And I guess a positive, there was a really good response from volunteers to help clean up the shoreline, but that also introduces challenges in terms of an instant management. It's great to have volunteers come forward and help clean up, but how do you manage that? How do you ensure the health and safety of the volunteers? How do you coordinate them on the shoreline? How do you ensure that they've got the correct gear? And even doing the correct activity, because of course people that aren't trained or aren't being supervised could unfortunately do more damage than good if they're not supervised or know what they're doing. And then lastly, SSL Calcutta. This was an explosion that happened in a container, led to a fire, the vessel was abandoned and eventually ran aground. Rough seas, strong winds hampered the salvage and response efforts. It was relatively close to a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Luckily, there wasn't really much oil spilt into the water, so from a responder's perspective, it was standing by, supporting the salvers. But shallow water, of course, because the vessel ran aground, did limit vessel suitability. But there was also other issues around what we call vessel of opportunity for conducting offshore oil spill response operations, containment and recovery. Some of the suitability the vessels offered in terms of health and safety wasn't appropriate. So therefore, some challenges in selecting the right equipment and support that you get locally to be able to undertake the operations safely and effectively. So hopefully that's just set some of the evolving challenges, a few examples of historical instance, and that gives an opportunity to people to think about what does that mean going forwards, opportunities for some questions from the audience. And now I hand back over to Captain. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. Well, dealing with oil and chemical spills can be far more complex. And from ship owners and their insurers' point of view, and those familiar with this territory know very well that a web of convention and protocols, statutes, and schemes, and the ever-changing framework of environmental laws and regulation makes the task of dealing with oil chemical spills really very complex. The existing principal international law and regulation governing oil chemical pollution has got a big list, but the first and foremost, of course, is the United Nations Convention on the Laws of the Sea. Then there are, if you can see on their slides, they are like CLC, the Fund Convention, MARPOL, you have OPRC, HNS, IMDG, IBC, London Salvage Convention, wreck removal, etc. And then beside that, there are some important domestic legislation, like for Arctic, he was just talking about Northern Sea Route. So you have the Arctic Shipping Safety and Pollution Prevention Regulation. Then there is OSPAR Commission for Northeast Atlantic, US OPA, of course. And then additionally, there is Merchant Shipping Act, actually, where these conventions are not enacted. They have their own Merchant Shipping Act, like for Singapore, India. For China, you have China Maritime Safety Agency and ISPRO. I will just skip through these slides because I think I'm now running short of time. My friend Darren took a little longer than. Yes. So there are international compensation regimes, so you can ask this question later if you wish. But I will just quickly go to straight to my next slides, that is P&I claims, actually. So as to the admissible claims or the P&I claims, this was the topic for my short presentation. Media sensitization, of course, this is one of the challenges that the insurers are facing now. And you expect journalists and news crew to come from all over the world if the casualty has a televisual impact. And mistaken public perception of the nature and extent of the pollution damage have often had a significant bearing on the economic consequences of spill. And sometimes they appear to have influenced the nature and scale of the response operations, which later Darren would talk about, actually. Legal issues then may arise as to extra loss and expenses not directly caused from the contamination from the spill. It now turns out that Mauritius claims for damages caused by last year, August 2020 oil spill could far exceed the limitation value. Because of the nature of the Wakasi oil spill and the way the response was handled, it could become a landmark environmental test case that could change international shipping and environmental law. And particularly, the Arctic nations are very much interested in the outcome from the Mauritius oil spill, as the International Maritime Organization is currently reviewing pollution laws around heavy fuel oil in environmentally sensitive areas such as the Arctic, particularly after the following strong criticism of the international shipping regulator. At the heart of the case is whether a particular international ship pollution law, known as the 2001 Bunker Fuel Convention, could lead to strict liability with unlimited limitation. This needs to be tested. Given the nature of the strict liability system of compensation regime, there are very limited scope for dispute as to liability for the spill. In practice, given the policy consideration, compensation has nearly always been available for payment of claims. As to claims, they fall into four main legal categories. The number one is cleanup operation and other preventive measures. So under the convention, the compensation is payable for the cost of reasonable measures taken by any person to prevent or minimize pollution damage. The second category is the physical damage, that is direct physical damage to property owned by the claimant. That could be movable property, say for example, fishing gear, fishing nets, and fishing boats, damage to fish farms, and aquaculture stocks, other pleasure craft, etc. And immovable property includes private beaches, piers and embankment, and importantly, industrial installation, etc., where we are seeing now a bigger claim coming from, actually. Now, the economic losses part is, the third category is quite painful for the insurer, which are the direct result of pollution damage. This is concerned with financial losses such as reduction in profits or earnings sustained by claimants as a result of marine casualty. Again, most common claims are fishing, aquaculture, and related industries, reduced catches, loss of earning due to suspension of harvesting, reduced sales or prices due to loss of public confidence in the quality of produce, and this could be really, really expensive claim. Other typical claim includes owners of hotels, restaurants, and other tourist establishments for loss of booking and trade. And claim related to ports and shipping could be losses resulting from delay and interruptions, losses resulting from diversion of shipping, basic reduction of business from the ferry operator. That could be also one of the claim element. And the fourth category of claim is the environmental reinstatement and restoration. And that is sometimes could be a really, really expensive claim, particularly for the increased public awareness. In practice, the claims have taken numerous forms and have raised actually many issues involving difficult questions of principle and law, which is beyond the discussion of this particular forum. Now, under the HNS Convention, which is not yet into force actually, the scope of damage is much wider. Here the claim expressly includes loss of life or personal injury on board or outside the ship. And there is no requirement of contamination unlike CLC. As to possible defense to claims, very limited. Act of God or act of war or natural phenomenon of an exceptional, inevitable, and irresistible character. The deliberate act of a third party, say sabotage or terrorism, or when it is wholly caused by the negligence or wrongful act of government or other authorities who are responsible for maintaining those equipment or navigational aids. For example, an authority cannot claim on the limitation fund if the pollution was caused by their failure to maintain navigational aids. These are some of the typical salvage contract form which are used actually by salvors and the stakeholders. The most effective preventive measures are usually those which avoid or minimize escape of oil from the ship, and professional salvors provide the first line of defense in the protection of the environment against pollution from marine casualty. Salvors award normally, in past they have used LOF form very frequently, but that has now declined. And as the statistics show, it was 255 LOF contract awarded in 1980, but now it has come down to 37 in 2014, and 2018 it went marginally up to some 40 odd figures. And the owners and their insurers, they often prefer the commercial contract, for example, rec hire, rec fixed, etc., or the LOF with side letter, which can cap or regulate the Article 13 award. As to cleanup operation concern, the LOF form is not suited for the spill response, and there is a separate contract for that is called a response con, and that is a fairly balanced contract, I would say, actually, to all concerned parties. Coming to pandemic-induced ramification on contractual performance. Now, various countries have implemented a regime of pandemic-related lockdown measures. Now, there are many countries where the restrictions lifted and then reinstated due to heavily infectious strain of the COVID-19. We are all aware of that. In some countries, there are different level of restriction, lockdown in different parts, province of the country. So the COVID situation has been changing very fast, and the information sometimes not really readily available to the stakeholders. And with daily changes in the legal and regulatory landscape as government enacts outbreak management measures, inevitably, many parties are finding it increasingly difficult to fulfill contractual obligations. It is unlikely that the pandemic itself will have had immediate ramification on contractual performance. It is the knock-on effect which will be an issue and which does give rise to a question of coercion and the potential disputes. Unlike in a sale contract or charter party where we see regularly the pandemic-related issues, insofar we have not seen any ramification on the contractual performance under the salvage contract. Some of the potential dispute related to liability, delays, extra cost, expenses that can include, what I can think of is like, say for example, delay in mobilization, demobilization of assets, which happened during the pandemic time. Significant delay in obtaining necessary permit and license, then the issue would arise as to who is responsible. Sickness, death of personnel, causing a spread of highly infectious disease, and then delay due to travel, quarantine, testing, etc. And then response personnel sometimes not willing to travel due to COVID, because he has to also think of his own safety. So there are provisions in the standard salvage form contracts which are subject to reasonableness of the parties. Now, the reasonableness, this word is actually fertile ground for lawyers and the people who are interested in dispute. Whether the non-performance, delay, loss was due to the circumstances beyond parties' control, and that needs to be considered. And although COVID-19, its recurrence and its mutations are foreseeable, careful review of the protective provisions in the contract should be taken by the parties.